June 1944, Saipan. The sun had barely lifted above the jagged ridgeline when the smoke settled into the island's valleys like a heavy, unmoving tide. The morning heat pressed against shattered concrete and burned-out vehicles, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of gunfire still hanging in the air. American Marines, moving cautiously among the broken terrain, listened for movement in the caves ahead. Small echoes, muffled cries, the unmistakable tremor of fear. Inside those dark caverns were Japanese women, nurses, clerks, communications auxiliaries, huddled beneath layers of dust and exhaustion. They had been told capture meant torture. They had been told the Americans would show no mercy. Their officers, rigid and expressionless, stood at the entrances with grenades already unpinned, preparing to force one last act of obedience. The Marines paused, hearing the rising panic inside. They knew what had happened on the cliffs days earlier. They knew what mass suicide looked like, and they knew that inside these caves, time was slipping toward another tragedy. What they didn't yet know was how close these women were to breaking, and how far their officers were willing to go to keep them from falling into American hands. The scene shifts now into the deeper story behind this moment. In the decades leading toward the Pacific War, Imperial Japan shaped an entire generation through a rigid fusion of nationalism, hierarchy, and myth. At its center stood a doctrine that had been reshaped and repurposed for modern conflict: Bushido. Once a code for samurai elites, it became a tool for the military state, a means of forging not only soldiers, but civilians into instruments of unwavering obedience. In schoolrooms, on parade grounds, in whispered guidance from local officials, the same message echoed: death was noble, surrender was shame. By the late 1930s, Japan's expanding empire needed more than infantrymen. It required support units, medical personnel, clerical staff, and communications specialists. Many of these positions were filled by young women, often recruited with patriotic language that promised honor and service to the emperor. They trained in uniforms that looked like military attire but lacked formal protection under international law. They lived and worked near the front, exposed to the same shortages, shelling, and terror as combat troops. Yet to them, it felt like duty, something larger than fear. As the Pacific War widened, the islands stretching from the Marianas to the Philippines became forward strongholds. When Japan began fortifying Saipan, Guam, and Tinian in the early 1940s, hundreds of women were stationed among the bunkers and medical stations. Some worked in hospitals carved directly into coral hillsides. Others operated radios deep within cave networks. They followed strict discipline, lived under constant supervision, and heard only what the military wanted them to hear about the enemy advancing across the ocean. From 1942 onward, propaganda intensified. Newspapers and broadcasts repeated claims that American troops committed unspeakable atrocities. Women were warned that capture meant a fate worse than death. Officers, hardened by years of indoctrination, reinforced these fears relentlessly. They reminded their subordinates, and sometimes even civilians, that an honorable end was preferable to surrender. In many cases, field commands issued standing orders. No one was to be taken alive. By 1944, the strategic landscape began to shift. The U.S. island-hopping campaign closed in on the Marianas. Saipan, once a symbol of Japan's forward reach, became a fortress bracing for inevitable assault. Japanese high command understood the island's importance. So did the Americans. If Saipan fell, the home islands would lie within reach of long-range B-29 bombers. What neither side fully anticipated was the human cost that would unfold inside the caves, jungles, and cliffs when defeat became certain, and how women, many barely trained for combat, would be swept into its desperation. As U.S. forces drew closer, Japanese officers tightened control. Food grew scarce, communications faltered, wounded soldiers filled makeshift medical tunnels lit only by lanterns. Across the island, rumors spread that entire units had destroyed themselves rather than surrender. For the women in service roles, some patriotic, some terrified, some simply caught in circumstances far beyond their understanding, the line between military duty and coerced sacrifice blurred dangerously. The closer the fighting came, the more aggressively officers enforced the idea that survival under enemy hands was unacceptable. Grenades were distributed not only to soldiers, but to nurses and clerks. Some were told to use them on the enemy, others were quietly told to save one for themselves. The pressure was relentless, spoken in direct orders or implied through the unyielding expectations of a system that saw surrender as treason. Outside these caves, American forces encountered scenes that challenged their assumptions: civilians running headlong over cliffs, families hiding with grenades clutched to their chests, combatants refusing medical aid even when mortally wounded. It became clear that Japanese troops and auxiliaries, including women, were not fighting only the Marines or the army. Many were fighting a deeper battle within, torn between survival and a lifetime of indoctrination. By the time the Americans reached the cave networks near Marpi Point and other strongholds, the psychological environment inside was near collapse. Officers paced behind barricades of boulders and sandbags, prepared to carry out final orders. Women, trapped between commands and instinct, felt the walls closing in. Every explosion outside sent dust cascading onto their bowed heads. Every shouted warning from American loudspeakers clashed with everything they had been taught to believe. This was the world in which the tragedy of coerced suicide and the unexpected intervention of American soldiers was about to unfold. And as the fighting intensified, the pressure on these women grew to a breaking point. The collapse of Japan's defensive line would push this fear to its extreme, setting the stage for the desperate events described next. By mid-1944, the defensive perimeter Japan once imagined stretching across the Pacific had fractured. One island after another fell to advancing U.S. forces, pushing the Imperial Army and Navy into a pattern of increasingly desperate last stands. Saipan became a symbol of this shift, a place where the collapse of organized defense exposed the full weight of fear and indoctrination among both soldiers and civilians. When American landings began on June 15, the Japanese command understood almost immediately that their positions were vulnerable. Their defensive lines cracked under coordinated naval bombardment and armored thrusts. Units that had trained for years to die honorably suddenly found themselves cut off from supply and retreat, forced into a grim calculus of how long they could hold before the inevitable end. Among these units were hundreds of women stationed in hospitals, communications shelters, and logistical support roles. Some had been classified as military nurses under the Imperial Army Medical Corps. Others were part of the Women's Volunteer Corps or civilian auxiliaries working in military facilities. All were under the authority of officers who had been instructed, formally or implicitly, that surrender was not an option. It was during this period that orders, heavily influenced by the ethos of Bushido and amplified by wartime propaganda, began to take on lethal forms. Accounts from surviving Japanese personnel and post-war investigations describe officers distributing grenades in small bundles, often instructing women to use them if the enemy breached their positions. In other cases, groups were told outright to prepare for Gyokusai, a term euphemistically translated as shattering like a jewel, a romanticized expression for suicide in the face of defeat. The psychological environment deteriorated quickly. As the Americans advanced northward, the sounds of battle grew closer. The concussive blasts of naval artillery, the crack of rifle fire, the roar of tanks grinding through coral ridges. Each new sound confirmed that defenses were failing. In the dim, humid air of the caves, women listened to wounded soldiers around them repeating that they could not surrender, that capture meant humiliation, that the enemy would show no mercy. These warnings came not from imagination, but from the voices they trusted, the officers who commanded every aspect of their lives. Outside, American units attempting to secure the island encountered scenes that deeply disturbed them. Families leaping from cliffs under officer supervision. Groups huddled together clutching grenades. Civilians and auxiliaries refusing water, screaming when approached, or attempting to take their own lives even when unarmed. Some U.S. troops tried to intervene, others watched helplessly as the consequences of years of indoctrination unfolded in real time. For the Marines on Saipan, this situation forced a profound tactical and humanitarian adaptation. Interpreters were brought forward. Loudspeakers broadcast assurances that women and civilians would be treated medically and respectfully. Leaflets written in Japanese were scattered across the battlefield, stating clearly, "Your life will be spared." Still, inside the caves, many never saw these messages. Those who did often distrusted them. The word of their officers outweighed anything the enemy might claim. In some cavern systems, the pressure became unbearable. Women found themselves with officers who insisted that dying together was the final act of loyalty. Some were physically pushed towards suicide points. Others were ordered to assist wounded soldiers in taking their own lives. The line between command and coercion blurred until obedience became indistinguishable from despair. By late June, the remaining pockets of Japanese resistance were shrinking into the northernmost ridges and cliffs. The caves at Marpi Point became among the last holdouts. Inside them, the tension between indoctrination and survival tightened with every passing hour. Women who had once carried out routine administrative duties now held grenades with trembling hands. Some wept silently. Others stared into the darkness, waiting for commands they did not want to hear. American forces, advancing carefully to avoid triggering further suicides, moved closer to these final positions. They had already witnessed the scale of human loss on the cliffs. They understood that what was happening inside the caves was not simply a military defense. It was a human crisis built from fear, pressure, and misinformation. The stage was set for confrontations that would test both armies in ways few anticipated. Japanese officers were preparing to compel mass death. American soldiers, in turn, would attempt something remarkable, to save enemy women not from their own side, but from their own commanders. This convergence of desperation and intervention forms the foundation for the complex angles that shaped what happened next. For the Japanese women trapped inside Saipan's collapsing defenses, the war was not fought with rifles or bayonets. It was fought inside the mind. Most were barely older than 20. Many had left home for the first time only months earlier, sent to the islands with promises of honor and national service. What they encountered instead was a world shaped by fear, scarcity, and the constant thunder of war. Inside the caves, the air was thick with humidity and the smell of antiseptic from improvised medical corners. Lanterns flickered against stone walls, stained by smoke and blood. The women tended wounded soldiers with whatever supplies remained. Strips of fabric torn from uniforms, small bottles of morphine saved for the worst cases, water rationed to mere sips. Every task carried the weight of expectation. They were told that their role was to support the fighting men until the last moment, and to share their fate when that moment came. Emotionally, the strain was immense. The fear of capture, planted through childhood education and amplified by wartime propaganda, became a constant shadow. These women believed the Americans were coming not to rescue, but to destroy. They believed surrender meant shame so deep it would echo back to their families. When officers reinforced these ideas with stern orders and bleak predictions, many accepted them as truth. The enemy outside the cave was terrifying, but so was disobedience to the leaders inside. Caught between survival and loyalty, they spiraled into a state where exhaustion, hunger, and ideology merged into a single overwhelming pressure. It was this inner turmoil that shaped the desperate choices unfolding as the battle reached its height. And at the center of this turmoil stood the officers who controlled their fate. Angle 2, the leadership angle, 250-300 words. The Imperial Japanese Officer Corps of 1944 operated under code that rewarded sacrifice and punished hesitation. Many had been trained since youth to see death in battle as the ultimate expression of loyalty. When defeat loomed on Saipan, this mindset hardened into uncompromising rigidity. Orders were to hold, resist, and if necessary, die. For officers overseeing mixed groups of soldiers, civilians, and women auxiliaries, enforcing this doctrine became a grim duty. Inside the caves, authority was absolute. Junior personnel rarely questioned directives. Women, often raised in strict cultural hierarchies, felt even less empowered to resist commands from military superiors. When officers began distributing grenades or instructing groups to prepare for honorable death, few dared to protest. Some officers believed sincerely that capture meant torture and humiliation. Others feared the shame of surrender more than death itself. A few witness testimonies suggest exerted control through intimidation, shouting, insisting, or physically coercing those who faltered. The leadership pressure tightened as American forces closed in. Officers paced with clenched jaws, listening to the distant firefights growing closer. Some spoke openly about choosing death. Others instructed women to stay together, suggesting they must die as a group. In their eyes, allowing subordinates to fall into enemy hands risked not only dishonor, but posthumous disgrace in official records. Yet beneath this stern facade, cracks appeared. Some officers hesitated. Others looked at the exhausted women around them and seemed to waver. But the momentum of indoctrination, built over years, kept many moving toward a final, tragic outcome. This dynamic between commanding officers and terrified subordinates would profoundly shape the events that followed, setting the stage for the tactical and humanitarian challenges faced by the American troops outside. And it was those troops who approached the caves with a vastly different perspective. For the American forces advancing across Saipan, the caves presented a dilemma with no precedent in their previous island campaigns. By the time they reached the northern end of the island, Marines and Army units had seen enough civilian suicides to understand that every step toward a cave entrance could ignite another tragedy. What might in other battles be a simple military objective, a cave containing enemy personnel, became a volatile psychological encounter. Tactically, the Americans adapted with remarkable speed. They began using loudspeakers, interpreters, and leaflets to communicate promises of humane treatment. Japanese-speaking Nisei soldiers played a crucial role, moving dangerously close to cave mouths to shout reassurances into the darkness. Medical corpsmen stood ready behind the assault teams with stretchers and water canteens. Officers instructed their men to hold fire unless absolutely necessary, hoping to avoid triggering panic inside. At the same time, they remained aware of the military threat. Some caves housed armed soldiers prepared to fight to the last. Others contained a mixture of wounded troops and unarmed women. Identifying which was which required patience and discipline. Patrols approached slowly, rifles lowered but ready, calling out phrases meant to calm rather than provoke. It was an attempt to counter years of Japanese propaganda with a few fragile sentences of truth. The Americans did not always succeed. Some caves erupted in violence. Others ended in silence, broken only by explosions from within. But each effort became part of a broader realization. The enemy's greatest danger to themselves was not simply the U.S. advance, but the orders carried out inside these underground sanctuaries. And in those dark spaces, a second battle, one fought in the mind, was unfolding. Angle 4, the intelligence/psychological angle, 250-300 words. As the scale of coerced suicide became clearer, American intelligence officers sought to understand the forces driving these tragedies. Reports from frontline commanders mentioned the same patterns repeatedly: entire families jumping from cliffs, soldiers detonating grenades while embracing civilians, and women auxiliaries refusing rescue even when starving. These behaviors were not spontaneous, but the result of a long and systematic indoctrination campaign. Pre-war education in Japan had instilled a deep fear of Western enemies, strengthened by wartime propaganda films and radio broadcasts portraying Americans as brutal invaders. This narrative intensified in 1944 as Japan's situation weakened. Civilians and military personnel alike were told that surrender would bring dishonor to their families and expose them to unimaginable cruelty. Officers reinforced these messages, sometimes explicitly claiming that Americans would torture or violate women. The psychological effect was powerful. Many auxiliaries saw death as the only escape. American intelligence attempted to counter these beliefs by producing leaflets emphasizing humane treatment and strict medical protocols for prisoners. Recorded messages in Japanese were broadcast from aircraft and ground loudspeakers. Yet even when these messages reached the caves, they often clashed with the immediate authority of Japanese commanders. For many inside, the voice of an American interpreter could not outweigh the words of the officer standing inches away with a grenade in his hand. This clash between misinformation and reality created an environment in which fear dictated behavior more powerfully than logic. And as the Americans prepared for the final push into the caves, this psychological struggle reached its breaking point. Angle 5, the moral and humanitarian angle, 250-300 words. Beyond tactics and intelligence, the events on Saipan presented a profound moral conflict. American troops found themselves confronting an enemy not simply resisting capture, but being driven to self-destruction by their own command. Saving these women required the Americans to act not as conquerors, but as protectors, rescuing people who had been taught to fear them intensely. This placed extraordinary emotional weight on the rescuers. Many Marines had fought through brutal combat only hours earlier. Some had lost friends, yet those same soldiers now moved slowly toward cave entrances with outstretched hands, offering water and safety to terrified women who sobbed at their approach. They coaxed, pleaded, and reassured. They risked being shot by hidden soldiers or killed by grenades set off in panic. Their mission became a humanitarian one, carried out in the shadow of ongoing battle. For the Japanese women, the moral shock was equally profound. Seeing American troops treat the wounded gently or share precious water contradicted everything they had been told. Some collapsed in confusion. Others wept uncontrollably, realizing the choice forced upon them was not between torture and death, but between propaganda and survival. This moment, the instant when fear collided with unexpected humanity, became the emotional hinge of the entire encounter. It redefined the identity of the enemy, reshaped the meaning of surrender, and opened a narrow path toward rescue. And it is along this path that the decisive moment, the climax, would take form inside the caves where the final confrontation unfolded. By early July 1944, the fighting on Saipan had compressed into the island's northern cliffs, where the last pockets of Japanese holdouts clung to the terrain with a grim mixture of determination and despair. The Americans had pushed relentlessly through the interior, clearing strongpoints bunker by bunker, cave by cave. Now they stood at the threshold of the most desperate confrontation yet, one that had little to do with strategy and everything to do with human will. Mapi Point rose above them like a wall of stone carved by centuries of surf and wind. Its caves had become refuge, shelter, and prison for hundreds of Japanese soldiers and auxiliary women. Inside the larger caverns, the women sat in clusters, knees pulled to their chests, listening to the distant rumble of American tanks and the intermittent thunder of artillery echoing across the ridges. The ground trembled with every impact. Dust filtered down from the cave ceiling, collecting in their hair, on their uniforms, in their lungs. The officers paced near the entrances, weapons ready, their faces drawn and shadowed by days of sleepless vigilance. They had heard the same reports the Americans already knew too well, that civilians had been jumping from the cliffs in mass numbers, urged on by soldiers who believed capture an unforgivable shame. And now, with American lines drawing closer, these officers hardened their resolve. Some whispered that the Emperor would expect nothing less. Others muttered that surrender was more frightening than any enemy assault. The women watched them with an uneasy mixture of loyalty and dread. They had served under these men for months, sometimes years. They had followed orders faithfully even as supplies dwindled to nothing. But now, as grenades were passed to them like grim tokens of expectation, their hands shook. A few tried to hide their fear, others failed completely. They were exhausted, hungry, and emotionally frayed. Yet the weight of command bore down on them with undeniable force. Outside, the Americans advanced with caution. Marines from the 2nd and 4th Divisions moved along the ridgelines, mindful of snipers and sudden explosions. The memory of cliff suicides lingered heavily in their minds. They approached the caves slowly, rifles angled downward, listening for movement within. Interpreters stepped ahead of the line, calling in Japanese through cupped hands. "Come out, you will not be harmed. We will give food. We will give water. You will live." Their words disappeared into the darkness.